when people are trying to represent otherness or difference in terms of sexuality, if something is being used as a weapon, like, like you say, if something's basically being turned into an analogy for sexual identity, sexuality, or sexual enjoyment as a threat, then you automatically have to kind of question, like, well, why are they doing that?
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Digital publishing expert and writer Nick Coveney joins Speculative Sandbox to talk about sexuality in speculative fiction, specifically the evolution of LGBTQ representation. We discuss how fiction can be used to challenge norms, the pressures and importance of representing a marginalized group, the political backlash to having more diverse voices in books, and how authors like J.K. Rowling can hurt a community. Also, do you love X-Men? Stay for the deep dive at the end. How's the weather out there?
It's absolutely stunning, which is actually a bad thing because London cannot cope with heat. We're not really designed for it. And we've had a record heat wave. I don't know if it's made the news over there, but it's been a lot this year. We don't have AC units in our houses because most of them are pretty old, and traditionally, like 50, 60 years ago, we wouldn't have needed an aircon unit. They didn't exist. So we can't cope as a country when it gets too hot. And we've had a record heat wave that's been lasting for about 2 months. So it's getting pretty bad. Like, our garden is just dead. Like, all of the grass has died. They've banned people using hoses in their back garden to try and stop there being a drought because they're worried about water shortages.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's getting a little bit intense.
Wow. So I live in Arizona, and I'm probably where I live is not equipped for flooding or snows, but we are probably the one area that's used to extreme heats, especially in the Phoenix area, where it feels like you're walking around in an oven during the summer. And I hear about the extreme heat hitting you guys. That has been in the news. And I think we also have it along our northern area as well, like Washington, and they have the same problem where they don't have air conditioning units. And it's kind of scary to be thinking about how this is affecting these communities because you don't have the infrastructure to support that temperature.
Yeah, and also because of that, we have a lot of green space traditionally, and that's now all basically turned to straw. So like everybody's garden and all of the grass lawns are turned into just like dry, dead grass.
Wow.
And all of our parks in sort of countryside, it's basically a tinderbox. So we keep having wildfires and stuff where, that would be something unheard of 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, stay safe. I'm sorry you guys have to go through that. It's crazy. You guys having that over the last couple of years. I know Northern California was dealing with very similar situation where they had forest fires everywhere. I would Zoom with my friend, and he would constantly be in the background would be like a red sky and ash falling from the sky. It was apocalyptic. It was so scary.
It's really quite troubling, and yet it doesn't seem to be kind of creating the kind of attention you'd expect it to. Obviously, there's a lot of things happening in terms of global politics, but it's just fascinating that everybody's still focused on how we can just keep going with the current status quo rather than actually trying to change things. So I don't know what more hints the planet needs to give us that this isn't sustainable and that we're doing a bad job, but just doesn't seem to be landing at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like as long as I guess the wealthy and the people in power feel like they can just power through it, and us lowly types just gotta suffer, I guess that's just how it's gonna be.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen Don't Look Up, but that film that came out, I think it was last year.
I have seen that.
Yeah, I think the problem is all those people assume that they'd be on that rocket, and therefore all
Yeah.
of our all of our leaders and power makers are kind of like, well, if anything does happen and this planet dies, I can afford to buy my way onto that
Mhm.
spaceship illicitly. So what do I care if every other layperson dies, because
Yeah.
it's not going to affect me.
Yes. Yes. I'm just waiting for the people who think that they're the ones that are going to ride on that rocket to realize, oh no, I don't qualify. I'm not that high up, and they could have done something and didn't, and now they're screwed. But anyway, while we get through these very tough and scary times, especially I look at I have family in Texas too, and they were dealing with some really scary flooding recently. Um, I guess we'll talk about sexuality and speculative fiction. So thank you so much for joining me. I know this is something that we've been working on getting together for a while, and I'm just really thrilled that we were able to make it happen. So Nick, tell me and our listeners about yourself and some of your recent projects.
Thank you. I'm Nick Coveney, and I'm delighted to be here chatting to you today. My background is working in trade publishing here in London, UK. I've worked for a number of publishers, including some of the big five like Hachette UK and HarperCollins. I've also worked for some smaller independents, and I used to be an editor many, many moons ago, and then I kind of became a digital product, digital publishing specialist, and I started working on apps and enhanced ebooks and audiobooks. And then I ended up working at Rakuten Kobo, who are a leading ebook and audiobook retailer, as well as a tech company that make Kobo devices, very similar to Amazon's Kindle devices. And now currently I'm working as a sort of freelancer in digital publishing space, and working with a couple of startups on things I can't really talk about yet, but it's all very exciting. And on top of that, I'm also an author myself. So I'm currently querying my dystopian YA fantasy novel.
Very cool. So now I've got to ask, what are your thoughts on the latest acquisitions and the situation between Simon Schuster and Penguin?
Um, I think that the merger is potentially very dangerous. I understand the sort of thought driving it. I realize why the industry wants to continue consolidating, but I do think that it puts a lot of power, particularly acquisition power, in the hands of one holding company, which is very, very dangerous. And I think it's fascinating because it looks like the Department of Justice is really recognizing this as a threat and kind of clamping down to stop it in a way which it hadn't done previously. Going back a little bit to what we were just talking about with my career history, I used to work for Hachette back when Hachette UK were the #1 publisher here in the UK. And what happened was, Random House published 50 Shades of Grey, and that
Mm.
became such a huge international phenomenon that they then acquired Penguin. So
Wow.
Penguin, who used to be like the second or third biggest player, got bought up by a smaller one because that publisher had grown so much from publishing 50 Shades of Grey globally. And then they leapfrogged Hachette and became the global #1 publisher. And that's all driven by Random House's parent company, Bertelsmann. So that's a huge media conglomerate in its own right. But it's just kind of fascinating that they've already leapfrogged to be the #1 player in the industry, and now they're trying to acquire Simon Schuster as well. And the #1 player will cannibalize the fourth player of what used to be traditionally called as the big five publishers. I don't think it's very healthy, particularly for the kind of overall ecosystem of publishing. Small independents are doing a fantastic job, and I think in a weird way, when these big publishers get bigger, that kind of creates more of an opportunity for the other end of the market. But for all of the other competing businesses, it's just going to make things far harder, because like auctions at acquisitions, how do we know that Penguin, Random House, and Simon Schuster are going to do everything they claim they'll do
Yeah.
to keep the industry buoyant? It doesn't seem like it's a good thing for authors or for readers long term. It's only really good for the holding companies involved and their profit lines.
Wow. Yeah, I saw that Stephen King recently testified, making the very, very valid point that it's going to be especially harder to bring in new voices as authors if this happens. So now that you're querying, how does it feel to query, to be on both ends, to have experience in both ends, I guess you can say?
Oh, it's kind of horrible because I feel like I know too much. Because I intimately, like I know what agents' lives are like. I used to work with agents. I used to acquire from agents. I was a commissioning editor before I started specializing in digital products. So I know exactly what the process looks like, and I keep having a few sort of like nibbles on the hook, but so far,
Mm,
no sort of firm offers of representation that I can accept. So I'm hoping that some of the current agents who've asked to review my full manuscript will bite, but I know that I've also written something that's a little bit ambitious for a YA novel, and it's a little bit unusual. So I'm probably trying to do too much at once and being a bit too bold. But because I do know so much about it, I know that it's also, getting an agent is just getting yourself basically onto the starting block, and that's
mm,
where the real game begins of going out on submission. And not every author who's agented ends up with a publishing deal, so it will be an interesting process. But yeah, it's both blessing and curse, because I know all of the stages, and I can kind of try and rationalize in my head, okay, this needs to happen, and agents are this busy, and this is how long the cycle will take. But also at the same time, I feel like I know a bit too much about it. It's
yeah.
a bit painful because I can see too far down the road, and it gets a bit dizzying.
Yeah, when I got my agent a couple of years ago, I remember having this great sense of accomplishment. And then I realized, and I don't know why I didn't realize this earlier, I was like, oh, I have to do that entire process again, but with
Yeah.
editors. And I think I had, I don't know how, when you feel like you've passed the finish line, and then you realize the actual finish line is like another 100 miles down the road. Uh, and now the submission process is so slow. It took 2 years for my manuscript to be accepted by an editor and then actually read by the editor. I couldn't believe it, but that's the norm now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that there's so many issues at the moment in terms of publishing staff burnout, both for agents and for people working in-house and publishers. Everybody is being stretched so thinly, and being asked to work across so many books or so many projects simultaneously, that rather than speeding up, which is what we all thought would happen with the advent of digital publishing and self-publishing. I remember when people were saying, right, in the future, acquisitions process will take 3 weeks or 3 months. And the truth is, for like a celebrity, or say, E.L. James' newest 50 Shades book, if that happened, that would be the case, because it's a dead cert. Everybody would just rush it through. Everyone would drop their real normal, day-to-day priorities, and books like that can hit the market super quick. But for every other sort of regular author, and particularly for debut authors who are just trying to sort of enter the ecosystem, it takes like upwards of 18 to 21 months, just because everybody is so thinly stretched already.
Mhm.
They can't work any faster than that. And I think it's a real sort of challenge, and it's making me consider self-publishing, because I also know a bit about that, and I know I could do that if I wanted to. But it's tricky, right? Because if publishers need to commission 2 years in the future, there's no guarantee that the market trends they're trying to observe now and cater to will still be as relevant in 2 years' time.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's such a lag.
I have anxiety about that too, because the book that is currently on submission combines science fiction with women's fiction. And it's gotten, it is a little bit, it's a genre blender. And while I hear that people want genre blending, I'm noticing it's hard to get it across the finish line because it's so different. And meanwhile, I'm watching a lot, and it has a Asian American POV. Meanwhile, I'm watching those types of stories getting released right now. And I'm like, if only I had been on that boat 2 years ago when we started this, I'd be right on with the trends. And now I'm like worried that I'm missing it entirely.
I'll try not to worry too much, because the good thing is that if those books hitting the market now do well, and show that there is an appetite, particularly for that POV, then hopefully that will help you in the future. Like it's one of those weird things. I mean, my YA is very queer, unsurprisingly, maybe, given what we're going to be talking about in a bit. So like I've got gay rep, bi rep, and non-binary representation in my YA debut, and I hope that that's the kind of thing that we can have now in a book which is more kind of like a dystopian contemporary fantasy.
Mhm.
In a post Heartstopper world, it feels like the queer community should be able to have myriad stories, and not just fluffy high school rom-com type settings. Like, I think life's a bit broader than that. So yeah, we'll see. But in theory, what might happen is that, you know, those books hitting the market now, if they do well and build up a good track record, that could actually like be useful in terms of having good comparisons, so that, you know, like when they're talking to booksellers and going out to the wider, because that's the other thing, like once a publisher buys it, then it just like moves on. It's almost like in a computer game, you know, you beat one boss and then you find out that actually it's one of those horrible bosses that's got like 3 or 4 different forms.
Yeah.
And the agent in querying bit is just like phase 1, and then publisher is phase 2, and then the final form is like it actually going to market and going into readers' hands, which is both, you know, the best but also the biggest and scariest bit. So
yeah. Well, let's talk about then sexuality and speculative fiction. And I didn't include this question. I just thought of this question, so I might be surprising you with it a little bit.
okay.
But knowing that there is a lot more LGBTQ inclusive narratives that are in books now, and they're really kind of starting to get the wave going. I know that they've been trying for a while, and now it's becoming a lot more commonplace. You're seeing a lot more of those stories on Netflix, for example, especially in America. And maybe you could speak to this in the England area, but I've noticed that it seems like in response to having more LGBTQ voices, the conservative perspective is starting to push back, and we're starting to see an introduction of some very oppressive policies and book banning. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I'm actually really glad you asked, because I think that a lot of your listeners might not be aware of some legislation we had here in the UK called Section 28. But that was basically a policy which predates, you know, Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. And it was introduced by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And it stayed effective in schools in the UK all the way through until like 2003. So when I was at secondary school, we had a policy called Section 28 that was part of the law of the UK, that meant that schools could not promote homosexuality. And the full wording was that they could not promote homosexuality as a pretense at a normal family relationship. So what that led to, unfortunately, was a lot of, for want of a better word, I'm going to say bigots, but you know, a lot of people with extremely conservative values, or very right-wing people who don't believe that LGBTQ people deserve to have rights or deserve the opportunity to exist. Those individuals interpreted that law as meaning that they couldn't and wouldn't already say anything positive about gay people, bi people, but they could be as negative as they liked. So some of the worst bullying I experienced when I was at school, because I got outed at 15 back in 2001, some of my worst bullies were actually my teachers, which is a horrible kind of, you know, and it's scary, but you know, like I honestly could never have dreamt of reading a book that represented me, my sexuality, or my kind of life when I was at school. That just didn't exist. There was certainly no YA being published in the UK that catered to it in the early 2000s. And the only novels that I could get my hands on, you know, I'd have to go to the local library and ask for it myself. And, you know, I ended up with my relatives, who have been very supportive, thankfully, of my sexuality, giving me books that, you know, they knew had a queer focus or featured men who fall in love with other men. But that was pretty much my only outlet, because it just wasn't featured in our schools. And I think, you know, now thankfully that law got repealed, but there are horrible rumors that in the UK we might have a similar legislation introduced soon that will basically do the same thing but attacking the trans community, which will make it illegal for schools to talk about trans and non-binary people. And that just shows how warped the kind of political lens has gotten. I think it's definitely a worrying challenge, but I think some of it really is just the way these organizations work isn't so much that because there's more representation they're lashing out, it's because they identify it as a friction point, I think. So that, you know, they know that there's a lack of understanding about this one issue. And it's interesting to see how in the UK, at least at the moment, the primary focus of the bigotry is attacking the trans and non-binary community, because that seems to be like an almost like a wedge issue, which can be used to fracture communities. And people who you might expect to be liberal, who you might expect to be supportive of individual freedom of expression, and who maybe 20, 30 years ago would have been very supportive of someone sort of saying like, this is how I choose to live my life, because it's being framed in a way that makes them feel like there's a danger and a threat. It's this kind of othering, which is actually very, very pertinent to the world of speculative fiction itself. But because trans and non-binary people are being singled out, that's being used to sort of weaponize it and harm everybody. But the thing is, this all gains momentum, and you have people now, like I sometimes get into rows with people online on Twitter and Facebook or whatever, because I'm very strident in trying to be vocal about being a trans ally, about my beliefs in the inclusivity and the importance of having inclusive education. Because for me, I had to basically set up a gay youth group when I was 16 with my local council to learn about safe sex, because that wasn't in our school curriculum. There was no provision at all that taught me about the need to use condoms when having male partners and stuff like that, because it just wasn't catered to. And it's a really important thing, because otherwise you just have generations of queer youth growing up learning about their sexuality through a lens of pornography and the mainstream media representation of it, which is always going to be skewed as a kind of negative. And now I find that when I'm trying to communicate these things online, I instantly get responses like, okay, groomer, like that's being used as a callback. And all I'm saying is that, like, you should acknowledge that these things are beneficial and that they help people, and that if you don't create it, then you create a vacuum, right? That's the problem. If you don't have good representation for marginalized communities, then you're leaving space, and that space will kind of get filled by the internet. And I think when it comes to sexuality, particularly in terms of like sexual health and safe sex, that will actually just become porn, right? Because if people can't find information that's going to be educational and helpful to them when they're on the internet, they're just going to find really sexualized stuff instead, which is really bad. So ironically, these people who are attacking everybody who's trying to fight for better representation are perpetuating cycles of harmful behaviors themselves, and they just use it as an instant put down. Like there's no real dialogue there. It's just an insult now. It's just thrown around, and that's quite scary.
So when we look at sexuality and speculative fiction, it's very interesting, because I think it really depends on who's writing it, when it was written, and how speculative fiction can be used to express sexuality, especially based off of the time that it could have been written as well, metaphors and all that stuff that could be taken with good intentions or misinterpreted as negative. For example, I'll pull out a trope, but like alien relationships, right? You can see that as a metaphor for in science fiction as the acceptance of people who might not be considered the main demographic, but some people might see that as, no, they are truly alien. And you just got to make sure that it's interpreted correctly, or you're looking at the right stuff. So let's define sexually and speculative fiction. I want to ask your thoughts on this. I wanted to find some sort of website or resource to help me kind of figure this out. I found enacademic.com. I'm guessing en means English, but the way they define it is science fiction and fantasy have traditionally been puritanical genres oriented toward a male readership. They can be more constrained than non-genre literature by their conventions of characterization and their effect on depictions of sexuality and gender. However, speculative fiction also gives the freedom to imagine societies different from real-life cultures, making science fiction an incisive tool to examine sexual bias and forcing the reader to reconsider his or her cultural assumptions. What is your thought on that definition?
I like a lot of it. I think that it's quite broad brush, and particularly in what it's saying about traditional fantasy and science fiction. I think the text that a lot of people look at when talking about sci-fi and speculative fiction, things like Frankenstein is kind of inherently got a queer lens to it, because there's this weird sort of tension between not just Frankenstein and the monster, but the explorer who discovers Frankenstein and the monster. And there's this kind of like male on male gaze thing, which is really fascinating. But Frankenstein is a deeply queer book in many ways. Like, the men kind of dominate it. There's barely any female characters who are allowed to be anything more than a corpse, or a victim and then a corpse, because that's just the way Shelley wrote it. But it's quite fascinating if you think of her relationship with Byron and his famously kind of multifaceted and slightly confusing sexual identity and sexuality. We don't know whether or not Byron identified as bisexual, because bisexual wasn't really being used in the lexicon at the time. We know that he had relationships with men and women, and we know that he was quite extrovert and quite bold for the time in terms of being open about those things. So if you look at Frankenstein in that lens, like, Frankenstein is a great book for representation of sexuality in sci-fi and speculative fiction, arguably. So I don't know that I agree with the idea that that it's something set in stone, that it's inherently restrictive. But I do think that for a long time, particularly the sort of early focus of 20th century and 21st century speculative fiction, it did seem to be something that for a long time, particularly once we moved into the pulp era, was kind of like just glossed over, or so marginalized that you blink and you miss it type references, where a lot of it then boils down to interpretation. You could have huge debates about whether or not something is or isn't trying to represent sexual identities and sexuality in that way, or if it's something that's like you say, deliberately being misinterpreted, or people almost clutching for representation and trying to like reinsert themselves back into it, like deliberately queering it. So I like that definition, but I think that it's got a few things that I would probably tweak and fine tune.
Yeah, it seems like it's catering to the straight perspective rather than being inclusive. I think that's a really, really good point. So how do you see sexuality being portrayed in fiction traditionally, before we break into how we break those rules later?
I mean, it does depend a little bit on the genre and the art. I think that for so much of traditional fiction, particularly in the speculative world, a lot of it is sort of replicating a sort of biblical scenario, right? So last two humans on X new planet or something, or new race on this alien world, and they have to go forth and breed like crazy, and that becomes inherently heteronormative in most cases. So I think when sexuality is reduced to just being like a biological function, that in itself, it can be quite reductive. But the other thing is that obviously here in on our home planet of Earth, blended families are becoming a thing, and it's a bit of a fallacy to pretend that queer couples can't have kids or can't breed, or wouldn't ever have offspring of their own, because it's just not true. And whether or not there's a IVF process in that, or something more far-fetched in a speculative world, is a question. But it's really fascinating, because I think that for decades people would sort of shut down any kind of like, well, of course it's not excluding other sexualities, because it's not like you could have babies anyway. I was like, well, actually, like we can, and we do, and also we did for decades. Like, it's just that those families would often be kind of hidden, right, because they weren't officially recognized, sort of like legally, but also by society. But we've been here, queer people have existed for millennia. It's nothing new. That's this thing I find really fascinating when I meet people who are like, oh, but this is all madness, it's all very modern. Tell that to the ancient Greeks.
Oh my God, yes. No, I totally get it. And how that biblical inspiration, this isn't a book, it's a movie, the movie It Follows. When you are, I've heard that it's a metaphor for sexually transmitted diseases, the idea that you have sex with somebody and then this creature. Have you seen It Follows, by the way? I should probably ask that first.
Not yet, but I'm not thinking maybe I don't want to, but carry on.
It's about when you are followed by an entity, and all it does is it walks towards you, and you can run away and it always just shows up again. And ultimately what happens is once it gets you, it kills you. The only way you can ward it off is by having sex with someone, and you've passed on that haunting entity to that person. And so what it talks about, what it's supposed to be, is like the dangers of unprotected sex and how it leads to diseases and that can kill you. But it's like, oh my God, can we be more scared of sex if that's the metaphor? And, to me, it's like, I'm in Arizona. It's a very conservative place. My mother was very religious. That, during the 90s, I had to kind of realize what kinds of things I was conditioned to understand just by pure exposure to things, right? You didn't have a lot of diverse stories, but I just knew that something, like, I felt very oppressed as well. And so as I'm breaking out of that, growing up and learning otherwise, it's like, we don't need to be fearful of sex. That is such a, abstinence only kind of way of thinking. And I think another one I wrote down, in mainstream fiction, sexuality is portrayed, I said what you said, was very heteronormative, which slowly changed as more diverse books are printed. But now we're seeing that pushback.
So many versions of kind of like the Messiah explorer, right? I mean, one thing I wanted to talk about later on was, like problematic representations of sexuality. So not going to dive into this example right now, but
Okay.
the things like June. There's so much you could say about June, and lots of people rush to defend it because it's such a beloved text that means so much to so many people. But the truth is that I think that when people are trying to represent otherness or difference in terms of sexuality, if something is being used as a weapon, like you say, if something's basically being turned into an analogy for sexual identity, sexuality, or sexual enjoyment as a threat, then you automatically have to kind of question, like, well, why are they doing that? Like, where is that coming from, and what's the intent, and is this genuine, or is this actually just very heavily masked religious propaganda, or the prejudices of the author being dressed up as something else? So I think that getting beyond the kind of Garden of Eden, like they must go out and breed and reproduce the population of the entire new planet they've just found themselves on. And another trope would be the kind of like, fighting an alien horde or an evil plague. And again, you could view that as okay, is this actually an analogy for heteronormativity, where what you're saying is that anything that's outside the heterosexual experience or outside the comfort zone and the sort of safety is what we view as kind of like a normal life, has to be crushed or destroyed because it's other and it's a risk and it's a threat and it will come in, plant babies in your chest or something.
Around the 1960s, according to this same resource, science fiction and fantasy began to reflect the changes prompted by the civil rights movement and the emergence of a counterculture. So new wave and feminist science fiction authors imagined cultures in a variety of gender models or atypical sexual relationships, such as group marriages or homosexual single-gendered societies, as the norm, and depictions of sex acts and alternative sexualities become commonplace. What are some ways that you've seen speculative fiction break some of these norms?
So this is a good example, I think, and one that I love as a series. But the Dragon Riders of Pern series, I think, is a great way of sort of showing this, because in the Pern books, the sexuality of the dragon riders and the dragons is kind of incidental. It's there. It's not problematized. It's not turned into a hitty stick to try and drive a political stance or to scare the reader. But it's there, it's spoken about, but in a very kind of de facto world building way, where there's representation there, but it's done in a way which makes it feel very sort of domestic and normal. It's part of the landscape. And I think that that's the kind of representation that I really appreciated when I found books like that growing up, because rather than tying into people's fears and insecurities and misinformation and brimstone and fury about their religious beliefs or moral judgments, if you kind of take all of that away, and it's just this is actually a different form of relationship, or this is a different kind of life, then it isn't inherently scary, but it doesn't detract from the plot. It actually enhances it. So I think the Pern books are a great example. And yeah, ironically, they were, I think, first published in the mid 1960s, as was Dune, which is actually the opposite. So I don't know if we should move on to this one yet, or if it's a separate question.
Yeah.
But Dune, I've always really struggled with people's love for, because when I read it, I was horrified as a teenager. I actually stopped reading Dune because the representation of the Baron is so sort of caricatured and hateful. And I gather that that there was a lot of discourse both at the time around publication and in the decades following. But I also, I've seen the original Dune films. I haven't seen the latest one, and I refuse to sort of engage with it as a fandom, because I think that's a very clear example of an author weaponizing sexuality, because the Baron's sexuality is a point of disgust. It's part of what makes him reprehensible. Now, obviously, he isn't just a gay character. He's a pedophile and also an incestuous one, but it's kind of like tying into every possible negative caricature, every horrible, harmful trope. And actually, it just feels like homophobia in the character. Like, if you were going to ask me to name like one fictitious representation of a character that basically embodied homophobia, it would probably be Frank Herbert's Baron. And it's quite clear that he had an openly gay son who he famously had a terrible relationship with and didn't approve of his lifestyle. And it shows, right? Like, the evidence is there. It's in the book, and it's in every. So whenever you kind of like celebrate that book or further it, you're also celebrating that representation, and I personally think it's quite harmful. So that's an example I don't like, but also from the 1960s.
I would love to hear your interpretation of J.K. Rowling. Troubled Blood centers on the disappearance of a woman, quote, thought to have been a victim of Dennis Creed, a trans serial killer. So there was a critic named Jake Carriage who wrote, "One wonders what critics of Rowling's stance on trans issues will make of a book whose moral seems to be never trust a man in a dress. The book appears to lean into problematic stereotypes portraying transgender people as villains, despite studies that show transgender people face high rates of harassment and violence." How is it over there with J.K. Rowling?
Oh God, I could talk about this for hours. I wrote a pretty lengthy blog post about my thoughts on J.K. Rowling, but that was predominantly about the Harry Potter universe. And I have had such a sort of strange journey, because growing up, I was very much of the Harry Potter generation. I got handed the first book before they were famous and popular, because I looked like the boy on the front cover. Literally, my mum saw this like bespectacled boy with bad hair and glasses and gave it to her bespectacled boy with bad hair and glasses. That's the level of my involvement. So I was there from the beginning, and I was an enormous fan of the series. And I used to actually, when I joined the publishing industry, I used to defend the series quite a lot, because I found the snobbery that people would kind of look down at J.K. Rowling and say nasty things about how the Harry Potter books didn't really deserve the success they got, really unpalatable. Now, I feel quite differently. And it's a huge shame. But yeah, Troubled Blood is a very, very harmful book. It's interesting because the pseudonym that J.K. uses for those crime books is Robert Galbraith. Now, there's been a few sort of overreactions almost on the internet about that, because Robert Galbraith is most best known, aside from being J.K.'s pseudonym, as a famous conversion therapist. So someone who used to torture gay men and try and give them like electroshock therapy and other horrible treatments in order to address their homosexuality. Now, I am not, for clarity, trying to claim that was J.K. Rowling's motivation in selecting Robert Galbraith as a pseudonym. However, I have worked in the publishing industry for 12 years, and for over 4 of those years, I've actually worked directly with Pottermore, like with their legal team and with the company that she uses as a legal entity to publish content. And there is no way in any universe that lawyers weren't all over her potential pseudonym names list.
Yeah.
Checking them, fact checking them. So it's not that she selected the name, it's that if someone turned around to her and said, oh, Joanne, you know that name you were thinking of registering for your pseudonym, it's actually, you know, it might raise some alarm bells for some people, or it might be a bit unsettling. There is no way that name was not checked. So I am sure her legal team, some poor sod at her literary agency would have been forced to look up the list of pseudonyms and see what competing, probably just to check if there are any other big books published by that author, because when you're creating a pseudonym, the whole point is that you go for something that's, you know, recognizable and iconic and memorable, but you don't want it to clash with a real living author because that would cause confusion. So, you know, the fact that she picked that name and then she kept it, and now she's doing all of these horrible things where she's writing books that just play into tropes of transphobia. You know, it's really scary and unsettling. I haven't read Troubled Blood. When she first published the Robert Galbraith books, I wasn't aware of the connotation of the US, because he was an American-based conversion therapist. You know, it took a few years for the internet to kind of latch onto that as a potential inspiration maybe for that name. So I read the early ones, and I was actually very upset by the depictions in one of her earlier books by that same sort of Cormoran Strike series, The Silkworm, because I thought that was incredibly horrible to aspiring authors. That there are some authors in there, because that one's all centered around publishing. So it's like, it's a murder mystery plot, but involving a literary agent and an author and a few other potential suspects. But, you know, it's all centered around the book industry. And the characters that she mocks, one of them is sort of non-binary, sort of gender diverse. So again, attacking the trans community. But the thing that they kind of have in common is that she's constantly saying horrible things about self-published authors. And it's just, that's when I lost all kind of sympathy for her, because up until then, JK did a great job of PRing herself as a kind of like, as a liberal, as someone who's left-wing, as someone who's pro, you know, all kind of progressive values. And then it became really clear that she only means her kind of progression. She only wants the things that she believes in, and she doesn't actually have a lot of empathy or humanity for anyone who isn't like her. And I find it really, really harmful. So with Troubled Blood, I'm aware of the snippets. I've read the quotes. I haven't read the full book because I refuse to give her any more of my hard-earned money. But I think it's really harmful. And she's clearly got a political agenda. I mean, the scary thing is, if you look at the timeline of the media coverage of the trans and non-binary community in this country, here in the UK, and the changes in terms of policy and the way politicians are talking about it, you can kind of almost draw a straight dotted line between when JK started to get outspoken about it on Twitter and wrote her Turf Wars blog post, which is quite famous now, and the increase in media outlets thinking, oh, great, this is a new community that we can start attacking. Because here in the UK, you know, what we used to do, our media would always be blaming the EU. You know, when we were a part of the European Union, the British media loved to mock the European Union and its crazy, you know, fuddy-duddy progressive wokeness. And now we're not in the European Union anymore. We don't have the EU to blame for everything. They're looking for other groups, other minorities that you can turn into a scapegoat for all of society's ills. And it feels like J.K. Rowling and a number of other people have latched onto the trans community as something to get angry about. And it's very strange because, you know, she's still an author, she's still writing very actively. But if you look at her Twitter timeline, almost every day she's tweeting something about, you know, the trans community in a way which is derogatory and harmful. And she's also claiming to speak for all gay men and lesbians, apart from woke guys with beards. So obviously I would probably fall into that latter category, but it's fascinating to me to sort of have loved someone as an author so much and have lost, like that earth is completely scorched. It's like she napalmed the Potterverse that lived inside my head, and now there's just this like charred, desolate rock, and I can never go there anymore.
Yeah. Well, I remember when she first started coming out with that stuff, and I was just thinking, well, I mean, because I was just as like you, right? I love the Harry Potter books, and looking into context, I think it's so important to look into context, because there's a lot of very important perspectives being brought up now about how things back then weren't as considerate as they should have been. But living back in the day, the 90s to early 2000s, I remember being an Asian American mixed race child. I would grab at anything that showed representation, and Cho Chang in the Harry Potter series, I was like, oh my God, we have something, right? And now, the Asian American community is like, you are aware that Cho Chang is like 2 last names, and it doesn't really show a respectful representation. It's very generalized. It's very what's the word I'm trying to think of? Anyway, so then I'm like, oh my God, like the realization that the one thing that you were clinging to is not great. So there was that. And then when she started coming out with trans stuff, I saw it in the media first. I'm like, okay, that can't be right, because I thought she was a leader of inclusivity. She was posting all these positive things. That can't be right. But then she not only leaned into it, it's like she dug her heel in and twisted, like she wanted, like it's out. And I'm like, oh, never mind. Okay. Very strange to have something that you trying to find representation wherever you could find it, to then have that kind of ripped out from underneath you, and realizing what the person is like underneath, not only her internal biases, but the fact that it's now being projected publicly and affecting others. It's so dangerous. And it's that betrayal feeling, especially because you're a child and you were impressionable. So I totally get that heartbreak.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I have exactly the same thing, because for me, Hogwarts was an enormous part of my childhood. I grew up with Harry, like literally the first 3 books. I was the same age as Harry. I have the same birthday as Lord Voldemort. So Tom Riddle has my birthday, and like some of my friends growing up would call me Voldy or Tom as a joke, because I was born on New Year's Eve and so was Lord Voldemort. So like I had all of that, and then I found out that my great auntie used to babysit for JK and is in one of the dedications. Like literally,
wow.
a distant relative of mine is called out as helping Harry out of his cupboard, which I used to really like, because I used to think of it as like coming out of the closet and being a nice reference. And now it's like, oh, why did you help her?
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out the rest, because it just came to me. Being able to navigate things, that betrayal feeling, where you have representation, then you realize it's not the best representation, and you realize it's actually bad representation. That's something that it feels like it's constant. How do you handle that? How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think it's important. I mean, it's such a complicated thing, because I'm very pro imagination. I'm very pro people, channeling their creativity and writing what they want to write. But there's this whole thing where people are getting really defensive, the cancel culture, the way people are constantly trying to sort of stop things from being critiqued, right? There is a huge difference between a critique, which can be constructive, informative, educational. I've been on the same journey with like the problematic representation of gay men in Hogwarts and the Harry Potter series. Like Dumbledore, I always knew Dumbledore was gay. I mean, his first appearance, he comes out in spangled purple velvet.
Mm-hmm.
She couldn't have made him look more like an Oscar Wilde dandy if she tried, because he comes out in like purple and gold. So his representation as a sort of coded queer man was very apparent right from the beginning. But what is Dumbledore? Dumbledore is like an incredibly complicated and distant figure who is powerful but also problematic. Dumbledore is central to the series, but gets it wrong a lot. Dumbledore puts, not just a child that he's close to on a familial level, because he was family friends with that child's deceased parents, but he directly forms an unhealthy relationship with a minor student. has a relationship with the wizarding equivalent of Hitler. Like, there's all these kind of reasons why Dumbledore is a bad character in many ways, or not the great hero. I mean, he obviously is a hero in lots of ways too, so it's more complicated than that. But like, that's the representation she created for us, was him, the most complicated, contradictory figure that you could possibly imagine in a kids book series, where he's both a great sort of savior figure, but also the one directly throwing the lead character in harm's way. And it's really kind of weird for me to kind of come to the conclusion that actually I hate that she used us like that. I really dislike that, and I really dislike the way that lycanthropy, werewolf representation was used as an allegory for HIV and people living with being HIV positive or living with AIDS. I really dislike that she decided to use that as a fictitious trope, because I think it was done in bad faith, and I think it was harmful and not nice. But the good thing is she had every right to do that, and I think there's this thing where you have to look at the overall balance of, like, do I want to control what other people write? I don't want to stop other people writing whatever stories they need to tell. I do want them to tell those stories in a way which is respectful, and I do want them to tell those stories in a way which is well researched and in good faith. So I think some of the conversations that happen now, where people rush to sort of say, oh, well, this book's being cancelled by the left, it's like, well, it's not being cancelled, is it? It's just being called out. People are highlighting the ways in which it isn't perfect, or the ways it could have been done better, or the ways in which it could be viewed as harmful. That's not cancelling it. That's not saying you pile them up and ban them, for example. It's just saying this isn't perfect. And I think no representation is perfect. We as a society evolve, and I think it's really important that evolution keeps happening. But the core thing is, and I hope that people in other marginalized communities would agree with me on this, because I'm just speaking as a white cis gay man, which means that I have many other forms of privilege beyond being gay. So my understanding of being part of a minority community is just limited to being an openly gay guy living in the UK, where I'm actually very fortunate compared to the realities of a lot of other queer men across the world. So what I would say is that it's really important that representation is done from a place of care and due diligence, because more rep is good as long as it's being done with good intent. What I hate seeing is characters, like queer villains who are there just because the villain can be gay as well, and that's just another form of promoting his villainy. It's really lazy. I think that marginalized communities deserve a voice in saying, actually, if you're going to represent us, can you at least get it right? And I think that's one of the things, right? With Harry Potter, you've got things like Seamus Finnegan, who's an Irish guy who blows up stuff. She wrote those books in the 90s in the context of the Good Friday Agreement and the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and was completely fine with putting a comedy Irish character in who blew stuff up all the time. That's not very culturally sensitive on any level. And you could name 1,000,000,001 different examples where people just rely on basically stereotypes, right? Like tropes. If they're not of that minority culture, the easiest way they can represent it is by thinking, oh, well, gay guys are always sassy, or always fashionable. So if I'm going to write this character, I'll make sure that they're really this, that, and the other. And it's lazy, but also it's not true. Like, people's sexuality is such a broad spectrum, whether they're gay, bi, pan, polyamorous, ace, that there's so many different forms of sexuality. And for some people, they're very fluid. I mean, I've known I was gay since I was 10. And for me, my sexuality is pretty binary, because I've always felt this way, and I've always been attracted to men. I've never been attracted to women in the same way. So, I define as gay or queer, but I have other friends who are queer men who are far more sort of fluid, or whose journey is kind of evolving or changing in terms of whether or not they view themselves as being bi or pan or poly. And any kind of combination, and that's all valid as well. There isn't one perfect answer, and I think fiction needs to reflect that. So when it gets to representing minority communities in speculative fiction, in fiction in general, you can't have like one sort of pinnacle where like this is the paragon that every form of representation has to follow, because the truth is we're all messy, right? Like everybody's got all of these different facets to them, and sexuality, gender identity, race, there are so many ways in which people can live different lives. And I think having an intersectional view of representation means that you have to kind of allow for more than one model, right? You can't just say, right, well, this is what gay representation should look like, and this is what sapphic, lesbian representation should look like. Because the truth is, even if you try and do everything the right way and you reach out to the community that you might not be a part of and try and represent their lived experience, you're not going to represent all lives in one example. So you have to allow for a dialogue. You have to actually like listen and learn and let people say, well, this is a great example, or I really enjoyed this because of X, but this bit of it is problematic and maybe we should try and move away from that going forwards, because otherwise people just repeat the harm to marginalized communities for no reason. And I think we can do better.
One of my biggest fears, and I've talked about this in a previous episode, is I'm writing from a marginalized perspective, but one of my biggest fears, and I'll hear from other authors, is doing it right and being well received from my own marginalized population. Do you feel that pressure?
Yeah, massively. I mean, I have no idea whether or not I'm ever going to be successful in securing an agent and securing a publishing deal, or if I'm going to get too bored and fed up and just self-publish. If I do self-publish, then it's very unlikely that it'll ever make headlines. But if I did live the dream and get a literary agent and then get a publishing deal with a major publisher and have my book promoted, I do think, well, how are other people going to react to this? Because my book leans quite heavily on some autobiographical stuff. It's basically a bit of a love letter to the boy who was my first crush, but explored through like a fictitious lens. So I won't say too much, but there's a young gay character, a young bi character. They meet when they're kids. I think the US equivalent would be like elementary school or maybe even kindergarten. I'm not sure, but they meet when they're really young kids and then they grow up together. And it's set across 3 different timelines, and they grow up playing computer games, and there's all these sort of like nice fun things, but they actually live atop a hellmouth. So it's very
fun.
Buffett. Yeah, I think it's fun. And we lived in this Tudor cottage, like the Elizabethan Tudor era. My family moved to a Tudor cottage immediately after my dad died. And there was a well, the village well was in the back garden. So there was this like centuries old, ancient and also like horrible looking well that was just part of our back garden. And it used to belong to the whole village. And then it was just like carved up and made part of the garden of our cottage. So in my book universe, that is the epicenter of the hellmouth, right? The hellmouth is underneath the well, basically.
Awesome. That's so cool.
Well, I feel you've got to weaponize your childhood trauma, right?
Oh, absolutely. Oh gosh, you're speaking to the person who did that too.
So I've got all of that. And basically, the guys grow up together. They go to different schools. They bond. They have fallouts. There's a love triangle and then like a love rhombus situation. And it's very will they won't they in lots of ways as they grow up. But eventually, they get latched onto by the hellmouth. And the whole kind of thought behind that is that because they're falling for each other, like their light is more attractive to the darkness. So like that's why the hellmouth latches onto them as the conduit to opening up. And what happens is that the gay character has this great like grand plan for them finally getting together, and it all revolves around them playing the final installment of their favorite computer game. They're going to play it together. It's the 3rd in the series, and then after that they're going to go on this amazing camping trip, and during the camping trip he's finally going to tell the boy that he's been in love with that he's in love with him. And then the games developer pull the plug on the game and are like, oh, we're going to save it for the next generation console. which happens in the gaming world a lot. Like you can be really hyped up and excited for this big gaming release, and then 2 weeks before it's due to come out, the games developer can be like, well, you're gonna have to wait for the next console for that. Yeah, so that the gay character panics and goes on the dark web, like the unofficial sort of naughty internet that does really exist, but we never really talk about. And he goes on the dark web and finds a pirate copy to download, and it comes with all these warnings that if he plays that copy, it might corrupt his system. But actually, he's not getting that from the dark web, he's getting it from the Hellmouth. And they start to play it, and then the world starts to unravel, because the more they play, the more the Hellmouth opens, and then they have to try and stop it.
Amazing.
So that's what I've written, and it's got loads of gaming geekery, lots of like X-Men references and the like, as well as computer game stuff. But I'm very aware of the fact that like it represents me, my imagination, my passions, and my imaginary bisexual protagonist who's the counterpoint to the gay character. I'm not bi, so I've had lots of my bi friends read it, and I've asked them, like, is this okay? Because I'm not bisexual, and I don't know whether or not I'm doing a good enough job for you guys. And also, my gay character, he's not going to be representative for all gay men on the planet. I'm sure there's going to be lots of gay guys reading that whole thing. Oh, well, I wouldn't have done that, or he's far too, flawed and problematic for me. But for me, I can only write the characters that I want to write. But I have attempted to do my research. I have attempted to reach out for other people for sort of sensitivity read, because personally, I think that there's no problem with having sensitivity reads. I don't understand why anybody would object to being sensitive when talking about things outside their lived experience. I'm quite strident on the stuff that I've included from my lived experience, because I lived it. So yeah. Some of my friends are like, oh, that's a bit dark, or that's a lot to happen when you're a kid. And I'm like, yeah, it stays in because it literally happened, or a version of it happened. So that can stay in, because I know that stuff like that can happen because I lived it.
Yeah, you don't want to erase your own experience and lose that voice.
No, and who knows if it ever makes it out into the world, then I'll make sure that I send you a copy.
Okay.
maybe people will enjoy it. Maybe people will see themselves represented. I don't know. But all I do know is that I think we can't let ourselves get to the stage of stifling creativity, or silencing ourselves, silencing our own voices and our own memories and stories, because of fear, right? That would be really counterintuitive. Like, just because of the fear of offense, or the fear of it not being perfect, to not try and share my voice, to not try and have my lived experience out there contributing, seems kind of wrong. And because what are we then entering into, where you have to have all of these factors ticked off a list before you get a chance to communicate it. I think that there's a big enough world out there for everybody to tell their stories, and as long as you do it with good intentions and the right kind of moral compass driving it, so you're not trying to harm other people, you're not trying to peddle misinformation, you're not trying to sort of like secretly push a load of religious or political. So I mean, maybe you are. Some people want to do that in fiction. Personally, I was force fed the Narnia books as a kid, and even as like a 7-year-old, I was like, this is just a Bible.
Yeah. Taking into context like what you were raised under, what influences you had, being able to challenge harmful stereotypes while also not falling into another set of stereotypes, especially because conformity, I feel, can go both ways. You have the conformity that you're expected to have from society if you're considered other, but then there's the conformity that might inadvertently happen when for example, I have a very specific relationship I have with my mom. Not every Asian American mother-daughter relationship is the same, but I don't want to erase mine to conform with what the louder population says, because then you've lost that diversity itself.
Yeah, and why should you? Like, for a start, that is your lived experience. But for a second, like the world can contain more than one. I know people say there's only 7 plots or whatever, but the truth is, we're all more complicated than I think we let anybody truly realize. Like everybody perceives each other through multiple lenses, but we all have lots of different facets. We all have more history than anybody expects, and we're all quite complicated in our own unique, exactly the same way. Like everybody has their own stuff, right? But you can't let the fear of other people, not liking your version stop you from communicating it, because that would be wrong, right? And also, what are you doing instead? If you did write a more traditional Asian American mother-daughter dynamic, but it wasn't your lived experience and it wasn't something that you actually believed in, you'd just be writing it as a stereotype to conform to the trope, right? So then you're almost like writing it deliberately in bad faith, which I think is way worse.
That's true. You're not helping your community at all that way. And the beauty of it is then people will read it and they'll go, oh my gosh, I had the same exact feeling. And then that validation, they're like, oh my gosh, I've enabled and empowered someone else to come out now with their story, is really powerful. So you have given a lot of great advice. I have a question dedicated to advice. So for writers, and knowing that you were from both sides of the industry, what advice do you have for writers when it comes to writing sexuality in fiction? And furthermore, if they're writing outside of their own sexual identity, how can they make sure to be inclusive?
So I think I touched on it earlier on, but I think that the primary thing I'd recommend is research. So, like research and outreach. So, make sure, if you know that you're telling somebody else's story, make sure that you're doing it respectfully and from a place that actually, you're putting care into it, you're putting due diligence. But I'd even go a little bit further and think, why? Like, why am I doing this? Like, what's the real motivation? If I'm being brutally honest with myself, am I writing this because this is the story I have to tell and I'm really passionate about it and these characters live in my head rent free and I know that I need to communicate their story and I've got it all plotted out? Or is it a bit more cynical than that? Because the one thing I worry about a lot, as more diverse publishing is happening, which is something I've longed for and lobbied for a really long time. So I'm really delighted to see more diverse books out in the world, and I want that to continue. I don't want it to be a trend. I want it to just be a part of the ecosystem, a part of the landscape. And I mean that not just in terms of LGBTQ plus representation, but generally, I just want more minority voices which have been marginalized to have the representation that they deserve. But I hate it when I can see something that I think is just like a cynical ploy or a bit of like a bad faith, a bit of inclusivity, where it's like, and I'm just going to mention this because if I do that, then that's a hook, right? I'm not going to name it, but there is a YA book that I read a few years ago that I've seen listed as being queer. Now, the author doesn't identify as queer, as far as I know. I've never seen that in any of the press. It's not in any of their, it's not on their website. It's not in any of the profiles, because I did actually go away and check, because I thought, okay, this is a queer book. I'm going to take that as, true, but I will dig into it and double check. The author doesn't identify as being queer. One of their characters is queer/gay. That character I thought was a terrible 2D stereotype and was actually incredibly harmful. And therefore them being sort of centered in this kind of really high octane, gossipy YA setting just seemed like a really bad faith bit of cynical inclusivity, right? Where they were using the fact that, and if I make that character gay, that's an interesting twist. And then I can make them, sassy and slightly toxic. And that's fine, because that's inclusive. It's not really. Like what you just done. You just put a bad character who's deeply flawed with very few redemptive qualities, centered everything around them in a way that makes them seem worse and pulls out all of their most extreme toxic traits, and you're using that as your example of gay men. Great, thank you. That's what we need in terms of representation. So I think veer away from anything that is being driven by wanting to pander to the market. I think if someone wants to include different sexualities or different gender identities, difference in their books, that's fine, as long as it comes from a place of authenticity, and as long as it's actually something that is integral to the story and not just something very, very cynical. Because if you're deliberately including queer characters because you want to market it to the queer community, rather than you genuinely want to tell that story, you genuinely care about it, you genuinely believe in it, that's not great representation. That's just trying to take people's money. So that's my kind of take on it. I mean, I think that the primary thing people can do is look into sensitivity readers. There's lots of great freelance sensitivity readers out there. There's a couple of organizations that bill themselves as sensitivity specialists, and that's a great way, whatever marginalized community you're trying to represent, whether it's sexuality, gender identity, racial, neurodivergent, there's lots of different ways you can be sensitive to representing people outside your lived universe, but you've got to be doing it for the right reasons, right? If you're just trying to do it to cash in on somebody else's life, like, A, shouldn't you let that community tell their own story to a point? And B, like, what are you really driving at? Like, do you think that you're going to be contributing positively, or are you just making a cynical ploy for money? And I sometimes fear that some of the stuff I see that's being billed as being mega inclusive, not actually that inclusive. Like, there are a lot of things that got published with great fanfare. Like, I think American Dirt is a really controversial book that got a lot of praise when it was first published and is actually quite problematic in many ways. And I saw this interview where people were saying, well, but what you have to understand is that the author's husband is an immigrant. Mm. The author's husband is an Irish citizen. So they're a white person in America.
This is the one about Mexican immigration, right? And
yeah.
I think at the book release, I read a story about how they had, I don't know if this was rumor or not, but that their centerpieces had like barbed wire or some incredibly offensive representation.
It's exactly that. It had barbed wire all around the tables, just for dramatic effect. Now, but publishers often use props, and sometimes they're a bit tacky, but that's just tasteless, right? Like, that is just really insensitive and very harmful. And look at the people who are commissioning that book and the people who are promoting it. They're not from that community. Like, it would be different if it was people from that country saying, like, this is an acceptable way for us to, and if that was the author's lived experience. But my understanding is that that's a white American lady who wrote that book, and she was inspired by the strife and struggles of her immigrant husband. That immigrant husband is from Ireland. Mm-hmm. So an Irish person in America, from the brief, I've only been to the States once so far, and I plan on coming back to visit very soon. But my experience was that, you're not treated in any way badly or othered as a European in America. In fact, everybody seems insanely nice about Europeans in America, because it's almost like we're exotic birds or something that just wandered out of the zoo.
Once we hear the accent.
Wow, yeah. Do you know the Queen? Do I know the Queen? Well, no, I am a queen, but no.
I love it. Do you have any additional remarks that you'd like to make, or promotions? I really enjoyed chatting with you. This is fantastic.
Likewise. The only thing I'm going to mention, because this is how we initially first started talking, I wanted to talk about X-Men and Phoenix.
Oh, yeah. Yes, tell me all about it.
That's what it came about. But I was just, I love X-Men, and Phoenix is one of my very, very favorite characters. But I do think there's something really, really fascinating about, like, taking the all-American sweetheart figure of Jean Grey, giving her ultimate power, and then deciding, do you know what, she should be a bad girl, right? Like, it's almost akin to, like, the weird retribution arc and redemption arc that Britney's had, where, like, she's sweet, she's innocent, she's perfect, she's everything, then she's destroyed, she's nothing, she's being used by her family, and then she's back on the plinth and being celebrated again. And it feels like Jean Grey and Phoenix, you've got this weird kind of continuity where she's the most powerful X-person in every universe for large stretches of time. But the major thing is that she makes really bad life choices.
Yes. Oh my God. Okay, so I used to watch X-Men in the 90s. Loved that show. I loved Rogue. I think because I grew up in a hyper conservative household, that Rogue's inability to, like, physically touch, like, I was like rooting for you, Rogue, but with Jean, what frustrated me beyond all ends was that she was So yeah, very on a pedestal, very idolized, seemed amazing, but she always seemed to have issues that prevented her from reaching her full potential, whether it's like, it's just too much, it's so hard, like when she's using her mental problems, and she had like I'm sorry, mental powers, and Xavier has to help her. And I just kept going, like, if she's so powerful as everyone is saying, why do they keep kind of holding her down
Yeah.
narratively, character wise? So I see what you mean about her.
And then, I mean, they changed it all with the Phoenix Saga, both the original one and then the Dark Phoenix Saga. They then gave her like unlimited power, but then she was too powerful. And I think the writers kind of realized that with a character like Phoenix in the mix, it's like, well, you're always going to have this sort of like secret source because she's a cosmic goddess, basically. So they had to find ways of limiting her power. And there were a couple of different narrative arcs. I don't want to put too many spoilers in for people who haven't read the original Phoenix comics, but you really should, because they're brilliant. I love them. But the interesting thing about it is they take this like good girl, and then they make her in Dark Phoenix into like the biggest badass. Like, she commits a lot of crimes, very briefly, because it only happens over a few issues, but she does things in Dark Phoenix that like no other evil villain in the X-Men universe does for decades. And it's really kind of like fascinating to see how much the writers kind of reveled in taking this character that had been so sweet and innocent and everything nice, and then thinking, actually, do you know what? She can go bad. She can go, as bad as possible. And it's like the original kind of like, am I the villain thing? She suddenly's like, oh,
I don't think I'm the villain.
I don't think I'm the villain. Am I the villain? And it's amazing to me. But I loved it so much. I always go back to that those two comic books, the original Phoenix Saga and then the Dark Phoenix one. I love them to bits, but they are fascinating. And then afterwards they're like, right, let's just wash our hands with it because it was all very messy. But the great thing about X-Men is they're constantly retconning everything. So
Yeah.
the old narratives always come back. I never talk about the Phoenix Saga films because they're terrible. I think the only thing that everybody kind of agrees on is that we do not speak about the X-Men films, particularly okay. X-Men 2 or whatever it was, where they tried to do Phoenix and just messed it up. But that was when they took the blinkers off Phoenix and Jean Grey. They kind of took Jean Grey and were like, right now, you can be everything that you've always had the potential to be. But the problem is, it's too much all at once. And what does that lead you? Ultimate power comes ultimate corruption.
So my exposure to the Jean Grey was, I think there were a couple episodes in the 90s cartoon, and then I don't know if the cliffhanger, my memory's faint. And then of course the X-Men 2, and then the most recent X-Men. And to me, it always felt like the way they treated, and what I assumed about Phoenix was that it was like a really big firework flash and then done, because she was so powerful that everything just kind of came to an end. Is that how it is in the comics too, or does it go on from there?
So for a while they played around with it. So there's the original like Phoenix arc where basically Phoenix is a guardian force that's invoked to help the X-Men fight the Shi'ar. Because there's the evil Shi'ar emperor. I can't remember his name at the moment, but there's an emperor who is trying to get hold of the M'Kraan crystal. And the M'Kraan crystal is basically a galaxy in itself. So if you were to open that crystal and channel its power, you'd have the power of an entire galaxy, which is what the evil emperor tries to do. And this is where you have like Xavier's psychic wife, who's a really fascinating character, who's called, oh God, that's going to really annoy me. Lilandra. So Lilandra of the Shi'ar is the sister of Tekken, and Tekken is the evil emperor. Tekken is the one who's trying to open the M'Kraan crystal. And basically, in the course of their adventures, Jean Grey ends up going with the other X-Men up to space station. This is before they know what's happening, before they know about Tekken and the Shi'ar and what's going on with the crystal. And then when they're trying to return to Earth, Jean Grey kind of literally has to sacrifice herself to keep the other X-Men alive. And when she does that, the Phoenix Force, basically like flying throughout the cosmos, finds her and latches onto her as a host body because she's so powerful, but also she's doing such a sort of incredibly wholesome thing and saving her loved ones. And it bonds with her instantly. And then for a while, like they have lots of issues where Phoenix Force basically it saves the day. It's like a magic wand in narrative terms, Deus Ex Machina, you just have whoop, Phoenix Force will save everything. And they managed to, stop the evil emperor. Then they actually, at the end of that arc, killed off both Phoenix and Jean Grey, and then obviously love of the character and for narrative reasons brought her back. When she comes back, then there's a while where she doesn't have her Phoenix powers, then they resurface, then again there's like quite a few issues where different things happen, and then all of a sudden they bring in the Hellfire Club, which is interesting because the Hellfire Club is the first kind of representation of Emma Frost. Okay. So Emma Frost's Emma Frost's first kind of narrative appearance is being one of the supervillains of the Hellfire Club, but she's being used specifically to unlock the psychic blinkers that Xavier tries to build around Jean Grey's Phoenix Force to protect her. Because basically what they realize is that when Jean Grey comes back, she's altered irreparably. The Phoenix Force doesn't want to leave her body, it refuses. But also the Phoenix Force, like, it wants to live, right? It's not actually had a sensory existence up until G. So when it comes back, it wants to taste everything. Like, it doesn't just want the nice stuff. It wants to try chocolate. It wants to try everything. And that leads to, this sort of like weird thing where you have Xavier doing something which is a bit problematic because he's kind of like putting mental cages within Jean. Like, he's going inside Jean Grey's brain and messing about with stuff to try and contain the Phoenix Force in a way that, Jean kind of consents to, but she doesn't really have a choice. And it's very sort of, I think it's really interesting in terms of, sexuality and everything else, having an old straight man go into this incredibly powerful young woman's brain and start messing about with stuff. And then when Emma Frost starts undoing those bonds and releases Phoenix, that's when she goes bad and turns into the Dark Phoenix, which is when it gets very interesting.
Okay, so then Sexuality and X-Men, how do you think they did in general?
So, I mean, I've always loved the X-Men, and I love it now even more than I did as a kid. And I always thought it was, analogous to being queer, but I was always very frustrated by the fact that, until Iceman's great retcon with Bobby Drake being the first openly gay X-Man, we didn't have any real queer representation for forever. But what I liked was they retconned that so much that they basically went back and said, nope, actually, in every historic thing of Iceman you've ever seen, even when he was sleeping with women, he was still a gay man. And I was like, yeah, if you're going to do a big series retcon and take a character who's existed for like 5 decades and then say, right, they're gay, don't just do it in like a small token way. Like, go full fat on that. Go really to town and say, yep, actually they've always been gay, and every time they've slept with a woman it's been a lie. Which is basically what they did with Iceman. And I think, X-Men is an incredibly important cultural phenomenon, I would say, because it's always represented the outsiders, right? The X-Men are, by their very definition, like the others. So they're always going to be a great way of looking at like marginalized heroes. However, that doesn't mean that they're not sometimes problematic and that the representation isn't really bad. I mean, there's a fantastic podcast you might be aware of called Cerebro.
I have not heard of it. No, is it about X-Men?
It's completely about X-Men. That's all it's about. But it's done by a great guy who's actually a literary agent called Connor Goldsmith. And he has the most incredible guests on talking about X-Men. I re-listened to the very first episode recently, which was about Betsy Brannock, which I could never really take seriously because Betsy is not what English people would call Elizabeth, right? She'd be a Betty or a Lizzie or a Liz. But for some reason, Betsy Braddock is who becomes Psylocke. So you had this weird thing where for decades, Betsy Braddock, like the character of Betsy Braddock, who was the sister of Captain Britain, which is our version of Captain America. We got Captain Britain. He had a telekinetic sister who at one point gets it through the magic of Avalon, which is, an alternative dimension that happens to have a bit of Arthurian lore whacked in there to give it extra Brit points. But they created this character in Betsy Braddock, and then they turned her into Psylocke. What they did was they literally put the brain or the personality and the sentience of Betsy Brannick into an Asian character's body and turn that into Psylocke. And they've now recently undone that. So you now have the incredible Japanese ninja character who's getting to live her own narrative, and Betsy restored to a newly, restored body. But for years, that was the only Asian rep in X-Men, right? Like Psylocke, but she wasn't even properly, because she had a British woman's mind in her body the whole time.
So literally wearing a costume of an Asian woman for representation.
A little bit. I mean, I think what they've tried to do, and again, this is where I give X-Men points, because I think when they do try and retcon something for the right reasons, they do try and do it right. So what they made it very clear was like, it wasn't a created body, it wasn't a made body or a morphed body, it was an actual woman with her own life. And then I can't remember, sorry, it's been a while since I listened to the episode. I can't remember Psylocke's like the true Psylocke avatar body's character name, and I can't remember the evil force that merges them together. But what it basically does is it takes a bit of both of them and then plays around. So what they've tried to create is that there was always a woman who had her own life, and then Betsy was almost like psychically forced into that shell. Yeah, but not intentionally. Like, she didn't consent to it. Neither of them had any choice over it, but it happened. And for decades, both of them completely lost agency or control of their own bodies. And now it's quite interesting, because we're now at a stage where there are, proper comic book series running where both these characters get their own proper arc and they get to be themselves. There's no longer this weird thing where they've just like merged these two characters together in a way which doesn't really fit.
Interesting. Well, thank you for teaching me about that. My memory is very foggy when it comes to X-Men, because I was really into it like 15 years ago, but I love seeing the legacy continue as more movies are being produced. So, and I remember, you're right. When we first met on Twitter, that was brought up. So it was really cool to be able to talk about that. I really enjoyed having this chat. I hope that you find representation soon. It's a crazy world out there. So hang in there, and hopefully, you'll get something. How long have you been on, what is it called? Querying. How long have you been querying?
I've been querying for just over a year, really. And I've had some very sort of exciting conversations, and it lead nowhere. And I've had someone give me some R&Rs, revise and resubmits.
Yes.
But I haven't really found the one, it feels like when you're querying, you're basically in a bad dating game where you're just looking for that perfect match. And until you find them, it's like, I'm just going to keep knocking on those doors. But I will continue persevering for a little while longer, and hopefully it'll work out. If it doesn't, then I know how to self-publish my books, so if I need to, I can always take that route if I have to. And I'm writing something else now anyway, so I'm going to keep going. That's more of like a proper gay rewrite of Frankenstein, which won't be a shock given our earlier conversation.
I love that. Okay, great.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.